industry doing clinical trials, and have learned a lot about drug companies, how they work, and I thought I gave a talk here about 10 or 12 years ago, maybe more than that, on sleep, and I thought I would not reprise that talk, but try instead to talk about something that is topical right now. I hope that isn't sleep. But so, I'm going to talk about what I call pharmacoeconomics and give you a little bit of background on why drugs cost so much money. But I thought first that I'd give you a little bit of background on the Lynn Institute. Herman already mentioned a little bit of this. We're a not-for-profit research entity. We have, let's see, is this going to work? Nope. I thought the pointer would work, but it doesn't seem to be working. However, no, let me try this. Being a good Boy Scout, I try to be prepared. There we go. Brought my own. Anyhow, we do a lot of work in the pharmaceutical industry. We have sites in Oklahoma, Colorado, and Arkansas. And my work, as was alluded to, really is in laboratory-based research in sleep medicine and esophageal disease. We also have a collaborative research effort ongoing with the OU Department of Family Medicine. We have grown, in fact, over the last several years, and we now occupy 2 floors in this building right here, which my friend Tom and I, every now and then, very early in the morning, he's an early riser too, we'll meet each other on the elevators. We did this morning going up to work. He's on the 6th floor, we occupy the 8th and 9th floor. We have lovely facilities there, we're very proud of it. We did not always have it so good, as Herman alluded to, and in fact, even before the basement in Baptist Medical Center, I thought I would show you our very first lab. So going to the basement in Baptist Medical Center was a big step up for us. I thought I'd start with some a little bit of a historical overview of the pharmaceutical industry. And some of you, I think most of you, are familiar with the fact that Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928. He won a Nobel Prize in 1945, but Fleming was never able to really develop penicillin as a drug that could be used to treat human beings. That was really done by a team of researchers at Oxford University who were able to stabilize the compound itself so that it could actually be used in a medicinal form. And they injected rats after they had induced a bacterial infection with them. The animals, of course, got very, very sick. They came into the laboratory one morning after the animals were virtually on the brink of death, had injected them with this stable form of penicillin, and they came in the next morning and found that the animals had actually turned the corner and looked like they were going to survive. And they were dancing in the halls, I can tell you, at the lab at Oxford, because these men knew what they had done and what they had discovered. It changed medicine forever, and without a doubt had a major impact on mankind. These other 2 individuals, Florey and Chain, shared the Nobel Prize with Fleming in 1945. Now, in the time that these experiments were done initially was 1940. England was embroiled, of course, in World War II in the Blitzkrieg, and were fairly distracted by that, and they were not particularly interested in trying to develop this compound or help these researchers at Oxford develop it. So guess what? They came to the good old US of A in 1940, and they hooked up with, oddly enough, a team of researchers at the Department of Agriculture in Peoria, Illinois. And that group and that effort really produced and developed penicillin as we know it today. Now, the first patient that they really tried this compound on, interestingly, was the athletic director's wife at Yale University. She had had a miscarriage and she had developed a bacteremia, and she was virtually on death's doorstep. She was given, of course, with his permission and hers, a dose of the penicillin. About 2 days later, she walked out of the hospital. And then subsequent to that, again we're talking about roughly 1940, 1941, the real impetus for developing this compound, and really the whole pharmaceutical industry began at that time, and it was stimulated by the need to really mass produce penicillin to treat wartime wounds. It turns out most of the deaths that occur on the battlefield are not from the direct trauma of a wound, but from the subsequent wound infection. That's what kills most of the individuals in wartime. And so this was used to treat wound infections, and you can imagine the impact that that had in World War II and subsequent wars. Now, this is a quote from a guy who has written a history of the Food and Drug Administration named P.J. Hiltz. And in this book, he says that while the wartime project that made the atomic bomb, things are dropping around me here, is more famous, it could be argued that the wartime project that made penicillin was more important. And that's a pretty profound statement. I think all of you in Rotary are aware of the work and the effort that's been done by Rotarians throughout the world to help eradicate polio. This was, of course, a much feared disease resulting in permanent paralysis or death. Rotary efforts to eradicate polio have really been recognized worldwide as a model of a public-private cooperation and a humanitarian effort. I think the Rotarians have actually provided something in the order of $500 million in support of the eradication of polio. And in point of fact, in 1994, polio was declared eradicated in the Americas, I think, in many ways attributable to the efforts of Rotarians throughout the world. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on how drugs are developed. And it starts with a molecule. Somebody at a pharmaceutical company thinks he has a great molecule for reducing blood pressure. And so that molecule has to be developed, tested in animals and so forth. And then it begins human testing, which is called right here early clinical development. Has to start somewhere in humans. And it starts in what is called one of 3 phases of drug development. Phase 1, the question is, if we give it to humans, is it safe? Can we give it to humans? And of course, when you jump from animals to humans, one never knows, but there, of course, is considerable certainty that it is safe. But that's the first question. And pharmaceutical companies have little mini hospitals that are called phase 1 units where they test these drugs initially. Then phase 2 is, well, does it really work? Does it, in patients who have high blood pressure, does it really reduce blood pressure? And these are smaller studies. And then if, in fact, it survives what is called a proof of concept study, then the third phase is large-scale clinical trials, which is largely what our organization is involved with. And so this process from the inception of the molecule till it's actually submitted to the Food and Drug Administration can take between 12 and 15 years. So this is a long, long process. What does it cost to develop a drug? Well, as you can see, the cost of developing a drug is steadily rising at a fairly remarkable rate, to the point that now, you can see here, it looks like it's over $1 billion. That was in 2005. Now it's probably close to $1.5 billion. So we're talking about roughly 10 to 12 years of time and well over $1 billion in cost to develop a drug. Now, this is a very interesting slide because what it does is it tells you what is the risk of drug development. And as we go along this slide, think about how much money is involved in each of these steps, which is lost when a drug fails. If you start with phase 1, 100% of the drugs that are here in phase 1, what percentage actually ends up going into phase 2? It's about 71%, about 31% go to phase 3 clinical trials, and then only about 21.5, almost 22% actually end up being approved by the FDA. So you've got basically an 80% failure rate. Now, if you think about the money invested in every one of these drugs, only 2 out of 10 are ever going to make it to market. The rest of them are going to fail at some point in time in this process, in which an enormous amount of money has been invested. It kind of reminds me of what Albert Einstein said about research. He said if we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't call it research. So who pays for this? This is an enormously expensive enterprise. Who pays for it? Well, you pay for it. I pay for it. We pay for it by pharmaceutical drugs. Prescriptions that we buy result in profits for the pharmaceutical companies. Very simple business model. Everybody in this room understands it. The more money you have in profit, the more money you have available for research and development. So it's a pretty simple business model. How much is spent on drugs worldwide? It's a staggering amount of money. It's over $700 billion worldwide. Now, politicians and other individuals are very fond of knocking pharmaceutical companies for all the money that has to be spent on drugs, and what a horrible thing it is we have to spend so much money on drugs, and so forth and so forth. And everybody has heard this. The fact of the matter is, only about 10% of the total healthcare costs in this country is attributable to prescription drugs. So there's some fallacy in thinking out there. But again, these are politicians that are making most of these statements. Now, there's some good news and bad news out there with regard to drugs and what's happening. And I'm going to sort of give you an idea of the good news. The good news is, if you look at generic prescription drugs, you can see that generic prescriptions are going up very steadily. This is the line that's going up, and they have been over the last several years. So the percent of prescriptions that are written for generic drugs is going up. That's great for the consumer because they're very cheap and relatively inexpensive. Coincidentally, not coincidentally, but concomitantly, the number of actual prescriptions that are on patent, which is where the pharmaceutical companies make their money, is decreasing very significantly, such that 56% of all prescriptions written now are generic drugs, and only about 44% are actual prescription drugs, which is where pharmaceutical companies make their profits. Now, what this has resulted in is a marked decrease, and you can see over time there is also a concomitant decrease in the number of clinical trials testing new drugs. So I think that's a direct result of the decline in profits and revenues that are coming from prescription pharmaceutical products. So it's good news and bad news. I mean, where's the money come from? It comes from you all. It comes from writing prescriptions of drugs that are on patent and so forth. So, again, it's a fairly simple business model that I think everyone understands. What are the reasons for the slow growth in research and development and drug development? Well, I think obviously one of the things is the economic decline. We have experienced that very directly in our business. That is, we are not making the kind of revenues that we have in the past because the pharmaceutical companies are starting to cut back and have been cutting back, largely as a result of the economic situation we're in. The rising cost of drug development, it is incredible the amount of money now that it costs to develop drugs. It's as I've already told you, it's over $700 billion in costs now and is being spent on drugs, and a percent of that, of course, is going to support R&D, but you're getting less out of it because it costs more and more every year to develop a drug. Political uncertainty, Obamacare, I mean, where are we going with that? What's going to happen with that? You're nervous about it, everybody's nervous about it because we don't know. Pharmaceutical companies are nervous about it. And as a result of that, they're cutting back and not putting the kind of money they were even 5 years ago into drug development. Medicare allowances, physicians, nobody knows what's going to happen to Medicare and where it's going. And again, that's a big political football. So there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in this whole arena. So it costs well over $1 billion in over 10 years to develop a drug. So what are the risks? Well, I think I've already alluded to that. But here's a quote that gives you an example of the risks that pharmaceutical companies take. This is a drug that we were actually involved in developing to treat Alzheimer's disease. We've done many, many studies with Alzheimer's disease and continue to do several studies. In August of 2010, about a year ago at this time, this drug was completely pulled. We get these faxes that come in that say cease and desist in all drug recruitment and finalize all the patients that are in the study. Have to shut down everything literally that day. And this quote came from the chairman and CEO of Eli Lilly, which is developing the drugs. Says pharmaceutical research always carries risk, as these results show. Despite this and other setbacks, Eli Lilly and Company remain strong and even more determined and committed to provide drug development to treat other Alzheimer's and other serious diseases. Now, this is a guy that just lost probably $750 million. And that isn't the only setback he had that year. If you think about 80% of drugs never make it to market. So this guy just lost an enormous amount of money. And this happens to us 4 or 5 times every year. We're right in the middle of a study and the drug is pulled for reasons of efficacy or complications or whatever. Now, let me just conclude, and again, this is somewhat pessimistic, but I'm trying to give you the facts. Some of you may wonder about the numbers. The numbers are, you could probably go find different numbers. So some of you may be familiar with people say, well, you know, you can lie with statistics, you can lie with numbers. And Frederick Mosteller was a very famous statistician, very worldwide, was known for his work. And at one time he was asked by a graduate student, he said, well, Professor Mosteller, he said, you know, people are always talking about how you can lie with statistics. He said, do you believe that? And I said, of course I do, but you can lie better without them. So the numbers are the numbers, and you can probably go out and find other numbers, but they're the numbers that I think are pretty accurate, and even though they are not terribly positive, shall we say. I think some of the low-hanging fruit has been grabbed off. We've got antibiotics, we've cured a lot of fatal diseases, and we've made enormous progress. So the low-hanging fruit has been picked, as it were. So we've got a very hard road to hoe now, treating and trying to discover treatments for diseases such as Alzheimer's disease. There's no question drug development costs are going to continue to rise. Costs of technology and the complexity of diseases such as Alzheimer's disease is going to make it harder and harder to discover cures, although every year we are taking on 2 or 3 more studies in Alzheimer's alone for looking at cures for that disease. So people are working hard out there trying to find a cure for that and other diseases. Economic constraints, decreasing drug company profits will significantly limit drug development. Again, that's just the way it is. You got to have money to do this work. Conflict will increase. What is going to happen, I fear, and I predict, is that there's going to be even more conflict out there with Medicare, because the drugs, and Alzheimer's is a disease of older adults. And so if we get a cure for Alzheimer's disease, and it costs $2,000 a month, which is not unlikely. There are drugs out there right now to treat diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis that cost $2,000 to $3,000 a month. What is Medicare going to do? Where are we going to find the money for that? So all in all, it's a difficult, perplexing situation we're in. And why should we be concerned about this? Why should we be concerned about the future of drug development? Well, the reason, as Charles Kettering said, is we should be concerned about the future because we'll spend the rest of our lives there. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions. Bill, would you like to answer questions?
Yes, sir.
Appreciate your time today, Rotary. My question is a little more basic. Why does the same basic drug cost less in Mexico and Canada? Which is to say, why is America, because we have the privilege of subsidizing what people in other countries
The question basically is, why do we as Americans have the privilege of subsidizing drug development in other parts of the world? It's basically the issue. I've asked myself that question many times, and the reason is because we do it. We don't have to do it, but I can tell you that 80 to 90% of drug development and all the new drugs that come to market, every compound is not necessarily invented in America, because pharmaceutical companies will in-license compounds from very small companies, biotech companies, but they have to spend the millions and millions of dollars to develop them. 90% of that drug development occurs in the US, Japan, or the United Kingdom. And I think the reason, if you look at Canada, drugs are much less expensive in Canada because they can get them from this country, from the same companies that develop them here. But they can't sell them in Canada unless they sell them at a certain price. The same is true in the UK, because if you're going to sell the drugs in those countries, the National Health Service, the NHS for example, says this is what we'll pay you for this drug, take it or leave it. And if you have a single payer system, then you take it or leave it. And in most cases, the pharmaceutical companies agree to take it. It's totally unfair. I've asked myself that very question, and that's another soapbox I could get on, but I don't want to do that today. I've been on one already. Yes, sir.
Hospitals are reporting their worst ever supply of drugs. Is that a demand problem, or is there something else involved?
I honestly don't know. I'm not involved in the hospital industry per se. A lot of that has to do with purchasing departments at hospitals. The cost of drugs is certainly an issue. But I'm not really qualified. I'm not a hospital administrator and have not been in that business, so I'm really probably not qualified to comment on that beyond what I just said. Sorry. Yes, sir.
Dr. Tang at OMRF has developed a vaccine for Alzheimer's, and yet I understand it's going to take years for the government. Why does it, you know, it's a horrible disease with no cure.
Right.
Why don't we take some risk?
That question is asked about every disease. The same is true of rheumatoid arthritis. The same is true of AIDS. Now, with AIDS, we were willing to take some risks. In other words, the Food and Drug Administration agreed to fast-track certain AIDS products. And in some instances, they have agreed to fast-track. But mind you, what you and I may think about fast-tracking something is not what the government's thinking about. They're thinking about going from reviewing a drug, when a drug company turns in all their data to the Food and Drug Administration. It may be 6 months to a year before they hear anything. And in some instances then they say, oh, well, you haven't done this, you haven't done that, we have some questions about this and that. You have to go back and do another 2 studies, which is another year or 2. And so, in point of fact, their idea of being fast may be 6 months from the time the data are turned in to them. But they have made some concessions in some instances, and they can do it. But it's totally up to the FDA. And I will also say that the FDA has what's called an orphan drug program for people who have rare diseases. And they give them very significant tax breaks if they will take on the development. Like, for example, one of the diseases I'm concerned with is narcolepsy, which is a sleep disorder. And there have been drugs developed under the orphan drug bill. Of course, my comment about rare diseases is rare diseases are very common in people who have them. So if you've got a rare disease, you'd like to see a drug developed. And so the Food and Drug Administration has made a concession to that by having what's called this orphan drug program to make it easier and more profitable to develop drugs to treat rare diseases.
The question here.
Yeah?
Is there a commonality between the sleep apnea and esophagitis?
No. Nothing obvious, which is probably why I'm doing it. My brain works in very peculiar ways. But there are connections, but I won't go into that now. Yes, ma'am.
I know that there are a lot of clinical trials that are now being farmed out to Eastern Europe and other countries. Could you comment on the safety and advisability of doing that?
I can comment on it, but it probably won't do any good, because that hurts our business. And I think that the FDA, for a period of time, about 10 years ago, the FDA would not permit any clinical trials to be used for data and support of drug development of a drug that was going to be used and approved by the FDA. They would not allow any. Now, they've changed their tune. And one of the reasons gets back to the cost of drug development and the time. Pharmaceutical companies can go into a place like China or India and get a clinical trial done in 6 months that would take 2 years to do here because of institutional review boards, ethics committees, and the red tape and the paperwork is almost unimaginable to people sitting in this room. So the Food and Drug Administration finally said, okay, we will acquiesce and we will allow some of these data to come in. Now, they have discovered the same problems that they feared, and that is the issue of quality. Isn't what it should be. There are some issues out there now such that the FDA is now re-examining this whole process again. And my understanding is that the latest word is that they're going to limit the number of foreign studies that can come in, and they will take a much more careful look at it. So that's good for our business, but not as good as it was. But that's the way all of that has come about. It's the whole outsourcing issue, basically.
One more question?
Oh,
Yes,
where?
sir.
Bill,
Oh, yeah.
do you do any projects on FDA-approved off-label use of drugs?
But we don't do any of those studies, and in fact, as you're probably aware, the FDA is very particular about labeling of drugs and off-label use by physicians. The pharmaceutical company can go to the FDA and say, we want to develop this drug for a disease that is now off-label, and the FDA will approve that and force them to go through this exact same type of regulatory process that it took to get the drug for its initial indication to get another indication. That probably process will take another 3 to 4 years. But that also is regulated and has to go through the FDA. But the drug company has to go to the FDA and say, okay, we want to develop the drug for this indication, which has nothing to do with the current indication. The FDA regulates all of that just as they would a new drug.
Bill, thank you very much. Next week's program is Kathy O'Connor, who is the new director of the Alliance for Economic Development for Oklahoma City. Jane Jenkins will be our chair of the day. Bill, thank you again for your presentation today. Thank you, Hans. Thank you, Tom, Susan, Tim, and welcome, Natalie, to the club. We will be here again next Tuesday for Kathy's presentation. And our thought for the day is, I think, an Irish proverb, or it might be the motto of the Lynn Health Science Institute, I'm not sure. A good laugh and a long sleep are the best cures in the doctor's book.